Hello, and thanks for mathing with me today. Today we're going to be solving one-step equations. Let's start with a little vocabulary. An equation is a statement that two expressions are equal. A linear equation in one variable is an equation that can be written in the form ax plus b equals c, where a and b are constants and a does not equal 0. A solution to an equation is a value that makes that equation true. So when we're solving equations, we want to find that value of the variable that makes the equation true. We use properties of equalities and inverse operations to solve equations. Inverse operations are two operations that undo each other. For example, if we add 2 and subtract 2, these two operations undo each other. So if an equation contains adding 2 to a variable, we would subtract 2 to undo that operation. When we perform the same operation on both sides of an equation, we create an equivalent equation. And that's how we're going to use inverse operations to solve, because we cannot do something to one side of an equation without doing it to the other, or else we no longer have an equation. Their two sides are no longer equal. So we want to create equivalent equations because they have the same solutions. So we're going to create equivalent equations until we get down to the variable being by itself on one side and a value on the other side. So to use inverse operations, we are using properties, the properties of equality. So like I said, if we want to add a value or subtract a value from one side of an equation to isolate the variable, then we need to also do that to the other side of the equation. So these are the properties of equality. I encourage you to pause the video and read through these properties on your own. Pause the video right now and take a look at the different properties that you will use to solve equations. Let's try some examples. In this first example, we have the equation n minus 2 equals 1. So what we want to do then is use one of our properties of equality to isolate the variable n, because we want to know what is the value of that variable that will make this equation true. So to isolate that variable, we see that we have n minus 2. So we want to think of the inverse operation of minus, and we want to apply it to this equation with the number 2. So the inverse operation of subtracting 2 would be adding 2. So we're going to add 2 to both sides. And when you first start solving equations, it sometimes is helpful to actually write the step that you are doing. Once you get really good at this, you will just do the step without writing the stuff that I write in pink. So to start out, go ahead and write it if it's easier for you. But I see that n minus 2 plus 2, right? Minus 2 plus 2 adds to be 0, so they undo each other exactly as we wanted. So all that we're left with on the left side is n. And on the right side, we have 1 plus 2, which equals 3. So we have solved this equation. We found that the variable n is equal to 3. And we can check to see if we are correct by substituting that value, this value 3, into our equation. So we can do it on our head. If we plug in 3 for n, we get 3 minus 2 equals 1. And does 3 minus 2 equal 1? Yes, it does. So we know that we have done this correctly. Now, the last thing that we want to do is write this answer in set notation. Typically, when we solve equations, our answers are going to be written in these set notation, which is these curly braces, all right, and then our solution inside the curly braces. So our solution then for this equation is 3. Let's do number 2. In number 2, we have n plus 3 equals negative 7. So the inverse operation of plus 3, how do we undo plus 3, is we subtract 3. So we subtract 3, remember, from both sides. We can't do it on one side and not do it on the other. So we get n plus 3 minus 3 is just n. And then we get negative 7 minus 3 is negative 10. So our solution then here is n equals negative 10. And remember, we put it in our curly braces, our set notation. And of course, I always like to box my final answer. Number 3, we have y over 3, or y divided by 3, is equal to negative 6. So the opposite of dividing would be multiplying. So we want to multiply both sides of this equation by 3. When we do this, we see that the left side, right, 3 divided by 3 equals 1, so we're left with 1y. We don't write the 1 typically when we're solving equations or when we're dealing with variables, so we just have y equals negative 6 times 3 gives us negative 18. So now we have isolated our variable, and we see that y equals negative 18. We write it in our curly braces, and then box our final answer. And the last one, we have 5w equals 55. So remember that when we have a number that is right next to in front of a variable, it means we're multiplying. So really this means 5 times w equals 55. How do we undo that? We divide both sides by 5. So I like to write it as a fraction. It's just easier. And then we see that 5 and 5 divided by 5 is 1. So again, we're left with 1w, which is just w. And 55 divided by 5 is 11. So here our solution is 11. And again, if you wanted to double check your answer, what could you do? You plug in your value, 11, plug it in for w. 5 times 11 is 55. There we go. We got our question correct. All right, it's time for you to try some examples on your own. So remember the inverse operations, and the goal is to isolate your variable and then put your answer in set notation. So pause the video and try these examples on your own. All right, hopefully you paused the video and you were able to use inverse operations and properties of equality to solve these 4 equations. Number 5 should be 5, and the solution to number 6 should be 7, and the solution to number 7 is a fraction. So I encourage people when we learn algebra, fractions are your friends. I know nobody likes fractions, but fractions are what we want to use when we are performing operations algebraically. It's much easier than decimals. We definitely don't want to be using mixed numbers anymore. So keep it as a fraction, even though it's an improper fraction, negative 47 over 4. And number 8 is 30. It's my hope in this video that you learn to solve one-step equations using inverse operations and the properties of equality. Thanks so much for mathing with me today.